Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Today we're going to go into the dark mountains of Kentucky, where in 1832 a family line kept secrets that no one could understand. Please let us know where you are watching this from, as it will move all of you. In the heart of the Appalachians, where forests go on for miles and valleys seem to soak up all the light from the sun, there used to be a community that lived almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. The rest of the world. Many people still thought of Kentucky as a wilderness at that time, and the law only reached as far as the mountains. The families who chose to live there did so because they wanted to be far away, alone, and free from all outside authority. People used to know the Appalachian region of Kentucky for its dangerous trails, deep canyons, and caves that go on and on. It was a harsh climate, and the winters could leave whole communities without power for months at a time. In the summer, the dense humidity turned the forests into real green mazes, where even the most experienced guides could get lost. This is the landscape where the family was going to talk about how they built their mysterious legacy. Even though Harlan County records from that time aren't complete, they still show something unsettling. A family had lived on a mountain estate for at least 3 generations. It was about 15 miles from the nearest town. No one was sure when they would arrive. However, older people in the area told stories about that family that would make any traveler think twice before following those trails. In 1832, a man named Ezekiel was the head of this family. People at the time said he was very tall and had a deep, dark gaze. He lived on a property that looked like a natural fortress with his brothers, their wives, and an unknown number of other relatives. Smaller buildings, barns, storage rooms, and structures with no clear purpose were all around the main house. An outsider could tell. The property was tucked between 2 mountains and could only be reached by a narrow path that wound through rocks. The family didn't talk to their closest neighbors very often because they lived miles away. When a member of the family came down to town to trade goods every once in a while, the talks were short and vague. In addition to animal skins and medicinal herbs from the mountains, they sometimes brought metal objects that showed a lot of skill. In exchange, it was salt, gunpowder, tools, and fabrics that they took. They never stayed long enough to get to know the local merchants and make friends with them. The county police started to pay attention when a number of people went missing over the course of about 15 years. People who tried to follow the Appalachian trails in that area never got where they were supposed to go. At first, these disappearances were thought to be caused by natural hazards in the mountains, like falls into canyons, attacks by wild animals, and getting lost in dense forests. It was common for people to get lost in that harsh terrain after all. But something changed in 1828, 4 years before the year that marks our history. A cloth merchant who was traveling alone from Virginia to Tennessee went missing in the same area where that property was found. A few weeks later, his wagon was found about 5 miles off the main trail, partly burned. His things were gone, but what really worried the police was the condition of the wagon. There were marks on it that showed something violent had happened there. There was fighting and proof that the building had been set on fire on purpose to hide something. Samuel Browning, who was sheriff of Harlan County at the time, started looking over old cases of people going missing. He found a disturbing pattern. In the same mountainous area, at least 17 people have gone missing in the last 15 years. It was either just one person or a small group of 2 or 3. There were no bodies ever found. There was never any solid evidence found. It looked like these people had been sucked up by the mountains. People who knew every trail, every cave, people who knew every trail, every cave, and every family that lived alone in the mountains. That's how Ezekiel's family name started to come up, but only in whispers and with nervous looks. There were hints, but no one wanted to say anything directly. There was a big problem on that 1-acre piece of land. The stories Browning gathered painted a picture that is getting worse. Some hunters said they heard screams from that direction at night, but they weren't animal sounds. Others said that strange smoke rose from the property at strange times and smelled different from wood burning. People said they saw family members on faraway trails, always watching travelers go by, never speaking, and always disappearing before anyone could get close. One very disturbing piece of information came from a nearby lumberjack. He talked about how, because he was following a hurt deer, he got too close to the family's land. Before he could figure out where he was, two men with rifles came out of the trees. They didn't say anything. They just watched him until he got the message and backed away. The look in those men's eyes, though, stuck with him for years. They are cold, calculating, and don't show any emotions at all. Browning knew he had to do more than hear stories and rumors to get things done. The time law asked for concrete proof, and trespassing on a family's property without a legal reason could have very bad effects on him. So, he chose to try a different approach. He started making a map of all the disappearances by putting together dates, locations, and details about what happened. He slowly put together a bigger picture of what was going on by looking at records from nearby counties and talking to sheriffs from other areas for months. What he found out was scary. The people who went missing weren't, only in Harland County. Cases like this had been reported in Bell, Knox, and Leslie counties, always near routes that went through that mountainous area. When Browning did more research, he found reports from more than 20 years ago, which suggests that this pattern had been going on before he became sheriff. But what really scared him was something he saw when he looked at the profiles of the victims. Almost all of them were people traveling alone or in small groups who didn't have family waiting for them. For them, when they got there. They were street vendors, gold seekers, and lone travelers, so if they disappeared, no one would look for them right away. It looked like someone was picking their victims very carefully, picking people whose disappearance would cause the least amount of trouble. Sheriff Browning decided he needed help in 1831, a year before the events that led to the most disturbing discovery of that decade. His trip took him to Frankfort, Kentucky's capital, to meet with state officials and give them his. Learned. It took 5 days to ride a horse across mountains, valleys, and small towns that didn't show up on official maps very often. While on this trip, Browning had time to think about how big the thing he was looking into was. The authorities in Frankfort were skeptical at first when they heard her story. After all, people going missing in the Appalachian Mountains were pretty common back then. The forests were thick, there was a lot of wildlife, and the weather was hard to predict. Wolves, bears, and panthers were still able to roam freely in the area. It was common for people to die after falling into ravines. A lot of travelers got lost and died of thirst or hunger before anyone could find them. But Browning made a good case. He showed off his carefully drawn maps that showed where most of the disappearances happened. He showed patterns over time, like how the number of cases went up when it was warmer and more people were traveling through the area. He showed witness statements that were not conclusive. When looked at as a whole, each piece painted a disturbing picture. There was something going on in those mountains that was more dangerous than the land itself. Theodore Harrison, who was the state's attorney, was very interested in one part of Browning's investigation. He said that some of the travelers who went missing were known to be carrying a lot of cash or valuable items. One of them was a gold dealer who was last seen carrying gold nuggets and dust worth about $1,200. A southern spice trader was another. He was carrying goods worth at least $800 at the time. In the years 1830, these amounts were not small. Harrison gave Browning permission to put together a small investigation team, but there was one catch. Before taking any official action against the family, they would need solid proof. Private property was still strictly protected by the law, and trespassing without a good reason could get Browning in trouble with the law, which would ruin his career and make the state look bad. It was a tricky situation that needed patience and planning. In the late fall of 1831, Browning went back to Harland County with two men who were supposed to help him. James Mallister, a surveyor from Louisville with a lot of experience, and Robert Chen, who was born in China and worked as an army tracker. Chen was very useful because, at the time, not many white men knew how to track people. He was able to read signs in the trees that other people had missed. These three men set up a secret base they were looking into was a boarding house in the town of Cumberland, which was about 20 miles away. In the winter, when snow made it almost impossible to get to the mountains, they carefully looked over every document they could find, talked to dozens of witnesses, and planned their strategy. Browning knew they had one chance to do it right. A pattern even scarier than the ones we saw in the interviews became clear. Several people in the area said that family members would sometimes go down to neighboring towns to sell things like pocket watches, rings, medals, and high-quality tools. When asked where these things came from, they always gave vague answers about getting them from family or trading with other mountain men. But Browning started writing down descriptions of these things and comparing them to things that belonged to the people who were missing. During one case, he became interested. Someone who works as a watchmaker in Harland remembered buying a silver pocket watch with the initials JTM engraved on it. The watch was still on his wrist. The initials made it hard to sell again. A chill went down Browning's spine as he looked at the object. There was a case from 1826 in the Missing Persons Registry about a hardware store owner named Jonathan Thomas Morrison, who had disappeared without a trace. His Virginia-based wife had given him a detailed description of a silver watch that he always wore that was engraved with her initials and was a wedding gift from her. The watchmaker said that he bought the watch from one of Ezekiel's brothers about 2 years ago. After Morrison went missing, the man paid with gold coins, which was strange for someone who was said to live alone in the mountains and farm for a living. Browning asked the watchmaker if the seller had seemed tense or suspicious. The watchmaker replied that the man had seemed completely uninterested, as if he were selling something that had no sentimental or historical value. Browning looked into other traders in the area after making this discovery. He found more evidence that was scary: a saddle for horses that was sold, some things in Bell County that looked like they belonged to a traveler who went missing in 1829, a hunting rifle made in Germany that was found in a pawn shop in Knox County and was said to belong to a hunter who went missing in 1827. The sellers of the items also failed to adequately explain where the personal items came from. At the same time, Chen started quietly checking out the areas around the family home, staying away to keep an eye on movement patterns. He saw that family members patrolled a perimeter of about 2 miles around their land on a regular basis. They knew every trail, path, and shortcut in that area. It was impossible to get close without being seen. Chen also saw something strange. There were side trails that led into heavily wooded areas that didn't seem to be used for farming or hunting. In February 1832, when there was a full moon, Chen did a risky observation at night from a high point with a partial view of the property. He saw lights going from one building to another, and heard sounds of activity that didn't make sense for that time of day. People carrying heavy things moved back and forth between the buildings. They were always quiet and coordinated in a way that suggested they had a set routine. These were not normal farming activities. There was something else going on. Mallister, on the other hand, focused on keeping track of money transfers. He learned that family members sometimes put large amounts of gold in banks in different cities, never the same place twice. The different amounts. They weren't scary, but when added up over the years, they showed a level of wealth that couldn't exist in the lives of mountain farmers who lived alone. Where did this gold come from? What made a family so wealthy when they were said to have survived by hunting and farming? Browning made a brave choice in March 1832, when the snow started to melt and the trails could be used again. A traveling salesman named Daniel Foster agreed to be his bait, so he hired him. Foster agreed to walk on the trail that was close to the family property, carrying things that look valuable but aren't worth anything. From a distance, Browning, Mallister, and Chen would follow, ready to step in if something went wrong. Browning thought the plan was dangerous and almost illegal, but he thought it was the only way to get real proof. Foster would be an easy person for the family to pick on if they were really after travelers. They would have at least tried out the theory if nothing happened. But if something did happen, they would be there to record it and do something about it. It was a risky game that could kill people, even their own. Foster left on a foggy March morning. He traveled in a simple wagon pulled by horses. Inside the crates that looked like they held goods, he put rocks and wood to make them heavier. Browning and his men followed at a distance of about a kilometer, going through the dense forest along the main trail. Chen led the way and used his tracking skills to make sure no one saw them. When Foster got close to the family home, something happened. The air in the forest felt different. Chen was the first to notice. There was no sound at all. There were no birds singing. Not a single small animal moved in the bushes. It looked like all the animals had run away or hidden. He told Browning and Mallister to be more careful and slow down. There was going to be an event. Foster kept going along the trail, acting like he wasn't worried but was actually very alert. He was told to keep an eye out for any strange activity and to yell a certain code if he felt threatened right away. Risk. The plan was for him to stay calm and try to act normally around anyone who came up to him. This would give Browning and the others time to get ready. The path went through a very dense stand of oak and pine trees, so thick that the sun hardly reached the tops of the trees. Foster slowly steered his wagon, paying close attention to every shadow and movement in the trees. At this height, the air was damp and cool, like a spring morning should be. His fingers were tight on the rein, but he tried to look calm. That's when showed up. 3 men came out of the forest as if they were made of air. When they got close, they didn't make a sound. They just stood there blocking Foster's wagon's path. All of them had rifles on them, but they kept them lowered. They weren't exactly threatening, but it was clear that they were ready. From his hiding place about 100 meters away, Chen saw them and knew that 2 of them were family members he had seen earlier. The man in the middle was tall and might have been in his 40s. His dark hair was starting to turn gray at a temple. It was scary how pale blue his eyes were, and the way he looked at Foster made your blood run cold. This was Ezekiel the leader. 2 younger men, probably his brothers or sons, were standing next to him. They looked a lot alike and had blank looks on their faces. Foster poured rain on the wagon, which stopped it safely. He was very nervous, but he kept his voice calm as he spoke to the men. He said he was a businessman going from Virginia to Tennessee with tools and fabrics to sell in towns along the way. That way. He asked the man if he would be interested in seeing his goods in a friendly, laid-back way that someone who is used to doing business on back roads would use. Ezekiel didn't answer right away. He kept looking at Foster, his eyes moving from one part of the wagon to another, including the horse and the boxes stacked in the back. He looked at Foster as if he were cattle being auctioned off, not just the goods. It seemed like there was no end to the silence before he spoke. Was going where he had come from, and if was going where he had come from, and if anyone was waiting for him somewhere specific. There was something about the way the question was asked that made it clear what it was really meant to do. He was checking to see if Foster would be wanted if he went missing. Foster lied on purpose because Browning told him to. He said his family was waiting for him. He was in Knoxville, that he had to get there by the end of the week, and that he already had business meetings with people in the area who knew his way. Ezekiel's face didn't change, but there was a flash of something in his eyes: calculation and disappointment. Foster couldn't figure it out. Short looks were exchanged between the three men, which made it clear that they were talking to each other. Then Ezekiel moved out of the way, making the path a little clearer. He told Foster to leave because he was on private land. Go ahead and don't go back that way. It wasn't help. It was a vague, dangerous order. Foster thanked them, flicked the raincoats, and started the wagon moving again. He walked past the three men with his eyes fixed on the road ahead and his body tense. Their eyes were fixed on his back as he walked away. There was a bend in the trail that blocked their direct line of sight after about 200 yards. That's when he let out a sigh of relief. What Browning and his men saw. The whole conversation from where they were hiding. Mallister was pale and had a tight grip on his gun. He told Browning in a whisper that those men were definitely planning to attack Foster, and that the only thing that kept him safe was his answer that he had family waiting. Chen agreed, saying that he had seen the three men talking to each other using subtle hand signals, which was a way for them to coordinate their actions without talking. But the most upsetting part came after. Chen chose to stay in the area after Foster, and the others went away to watch what the family did next. He built himself a high platform from which he could see the side trails he had already found. He was very scared by what he saw. Ezekiel and the two men did not go back to the property right away. Instead, they split up and each went their own way, as if they were checking something or scouting certain areas. Chen kept a safe distance from Ezekiel and used all of his skills to stay hidden. The man walked through the thick forest for about 2 miles until he reached a particularly dense area where tall grass and downed trees made natural barriers. Ezekiel stopped in front of what looked like another group of rocks and downed trees, but then he moved some branches, which revealed a hole in the ground that looked like the entrance to a thoroughly hidden cave or cellar. Ezekiel fell into the opening and was no longer there. Chen did nothing for almost an hour while he waited for the man to come back out. When Ezekiel came out, brought a duffel bag he hadn't had before. He carefully moved the camouflage back over the entrance, looked around to see if there were any signs of an intruder, and then went back along the same path to the main property. Chen mentally marked the exact spot where that hidden entrance was. He was sure he had found something important, but he also knew he couldn't look into it by himself at that time. The family would know they were being watched if there was any noise at the scene. He had to tell someone, to Browning, and make plans for an official approach that is legal. When the investigators got together again that night at the Cumberland boarding house, Chen told them in great detail what he had found. Browning was both scared and excited at the same time. They finally had proof. Their main suspect had gotten into a secret building in the woods that had been kept secret. What did this cave or cellar under the ground hold, though? What could they do to look into it without putting their own lives or the case at risk? Based on what Chen saw, Mallister suggested they get a search warrant, but Browning knew this would be a bad idea. A judge might ask how they knew about the secret entrance without going on someone else's property. Also, if the police moved, they would let the family know. They could then destroy evidence or just disappear into the endless Appalachian Mountains. They needed a more sneaky plan. Foster was the one who thought of it. He told them to pretend to be lost travelers who need help as a way to get close to the property without looking like you're up to no good. If they could get into the main property and look inside the buildings, they might see proof that an official search is needed. It was risky, but not as much as trying to check out the secret road into the forest without permission. Browning gave the idea a lot of thought. At that time, Kentucky law had specific rules about how the government could get into private property. If there was a good reason to think a crime was being committed a crime or accepted an invitation from the owners, it would be legal for them to enter. But breaking in without a warrant or proof of a crime about to happen would be against the law and could ruin any case they worked on. As they talked about their plans, word came that a traveler had been through the area. Marcus Webb, a leather trader from North Carolina, had been seen 3 days before on the same trail that Foster and his friends had used to meet Ezekiel and his friends. Webb was not with anyone when he was traveling. Family, carrying things that are valuable. He was meant to be in a nearby town 2 days ago, but he never showed up. Browning felt like he had a weight on his shoulders. While they planned and talked about the law, it's likely that someone else died. He made up his mind. They were done waiting. The next morning, he and Mallister would go to the family home and say they were from the police department looking into Webb's disappearance. Chen would stay hidden in the woods and watch, ready to step in if necessary. Something went wrong. That night, none of the 3 men got enough rest. All of them knew they were about to face something very scary, something that had probably been going on in those mountains for decades without anyone noticing. The stories they had collected, the things they had tracked, and the patterns they had drawn all led them to a scary conclusion about this family. In April 1832, dawn came with a gray sky full of low clouds that looked like they were about to start a storm. Browning and Mallister got ready. They rode their horses quietly, each thinking about what they might see that day. Chen had already left before dawn, taking the side trails to set himself up near the property without being seen. It took about 2 hours to get to the property's entrance. As they went higher up the mountain, the trail got narrower and less level. It wound around rock formations that looked like a natural maze. Browning knew that anyone who wanted to get to the site would need to know precisely the right path, since several false trails split off from the main path and led to dead ends or dangerous ravines. When they finally saw the property, both men were amazed at how big it was and how well it was put together. The main house was made of stone and logs and had 2 stories. It had small windows and a wide front porch. Around it, in what looked like a planned pattern, were at least 7 smaller buildings, including barns, storage rooms, workshops, and other structures whose purpose wasn't clear at first. Easy to see. Strong fences and clear paths between the buildings made sure that everything was in great shape. The silence was the thing that struck Browning the most. Not a single chicken was scratching, dog was barking, or pig was digging in the dirt. It was odd that there were no pets on a property that size that was supposed to be able to accommodate a big family. The way the buildings were set up also made it feel like someone was watching, like each one was placed to allow full surveillance, looking at things from every angle. Before they could get off their horses, the door to the main house opened. Ezekiel and 4 other men, all carrying rifles that were not aimed but were easy to see, came out. As Ezekiel slowly and deliberately walked down the porch steps, his eyes were fixed on the visitors with the same unsettling intensity that Foster had described. At about 10 yards away, he stopped in a way that made it impossible to get to the house directly. When Browning formally introduced himself, he showed his sheriff's badge and, telling them that he was looking into what happened to Marcus Webb. He asked if anyone on the property had seen the man in the last few days and gave details about the man's appearance and the wagon he was pulling. It was clear from the tone of his voice that he wasn't trying to scare them, but he did want them to work with him. Ezekiel listened quietly with no emotion in his face at all. Browning just shook his head when he was done talking. He said that in the last few days they hadn't seen any travelers. They didn't have many visitors in the area because they chose to keep their family alone and didn't want to get involved in things going on in other places. That low, monotone tone in his voice didn't change at all when he spoke. Mallister paid close attention and noticed something strange about the other men. When the police showed up on their property, they didn't move, talk to each other, or react in any way that would be expected. They stood there like statues, with blank looks on their faces and eyes fixed on the people who were there. Something deeply unnatural about their silence made it seem like they were extensions of Ezekiel's will, instead of people with their own thoughts. More was said by Browning, who said that other travelers had also gone missing in the area over the years. He asked the family if they knew of any specific dangers in the mountains, like wild animals that are especially mean or groups of thieves who work the trails. While he talked, he looked around the area quietly, looking for anything out of the ordinary or a sign. That called for more investigation. He saw it at that point. A wagon was parked behind one of the barns, but it was partly hidden by a stack of firewood. It wasn't clear from where they were standing at first, but when one of Browning's horses moved, he could see part of the structure. It looked a lot like the wagon Webb was said to have driven. Browning could feel his heart beating faster, but he kept a neutral face. Ezekiel did what Browning said. Look and knew what he had seen. Something went over his face for a split second. It wasn't really fear or guilt. It was a smart acceptance that things had changed. He spoke in the same monotone as before, saying that they had found the abandoned wagon on the trail 2 days before and brought it to the property in the hopes that the owner would come back to get it. They had planned to call the police, but hadn't had time to go to town. The explanation made sense on the surface, but Browning had been through too much to believe in lucky coincidences. He asked nicely if he could look at the wagon, implying that a no answer would make him look suspicious. For the first time, Ezekiel's eyes got a little narrow as he hesitated. The other men moved slowly, putting their fingers closer to the gun triggers. It was possible to feel the tension in the air. Mallister put his hand on the butt of his own gun in a sneaky way, ready to act if things got worse. Browning did not move while he waited for Ezekiel to answer. He knew that what he did next would determine what happened next. As the patriarch thought about his choices, seconds seemed to turn into minutes. Ezekiel finally gave a stiff nod. He told Browning that he could look at the wagon, but that he couldn't search other family property without a formal warrant. His voice was sure of itself when it came to the law, which surprised Browning. The man knew what his rights were and how to use them. A sheriff could do a lot of things without the right paperwork. This showed that he had dealt with the police before and knew how to follow the law's complicated rules. Browning got off the horse and walked toward the wagon, and Mallister was right behind him. Also, Ezekiel and his men moved, but they kept their distance and watched the investigators' every move. Browning felt sick to his stomach when he got close enough to look at the wagon properly. There was no doubt that it was a wagon for merchants. There were clear signs that things had been taken from it recently. The dark spots on the wood at the back of the wagon were even scarier. There was no way Browning could miss blood, even if someone was trying to clean it up. The stains were arranged in a way that suggested a lot of violence. Around the wagon, there were also marks on the ground that looked like something heavy had been moved to one of the smaller buildings in the back of the property. What Mallister saw. Something else. Pieces of torn fabric were stuck between the wagon's planks. He carefully took them off and looked at the pattern and quality. Fine linen that had been dyed a dark blue color, like clothes worn by merchants at the time. This style of clothing was exactly what Webb was said to be wearing when he was last seen. More and more evidence was coming in, but it wasn't yet strong enough to arrest anyone right away. Browning looked at Ezekiel and asked directly where they had found the wagon that had been left behind. Ezekiel made a vague point, toward the mountains to the north, saying that it was lying on its side on the trail, without a horse and with no one else around. He said they thought wild animals had hurt the horse and the owner had run off into the woods. The story might have been true, but Browning knew it wasn't. Something very strange happened at that very moment. A faint but clear sound came from inside the main house. It was a person's voice, but it was muffled, like someone was yelling through layers of material or from behind a door that is locked. The sound was only there for a few seconds before it stopped all of a sudden, but Browning and Mallister could clearly hear it. Someone tried to call for help but was stuck inside that house. Ezekiel's response happened right away. He took a step forward, blocking the way to the house, and his hand moved decisively to the gun he was carrying. The other men did the same thing, making a line between the police and the main residence. It went from being tense but quiet to being open, a disagreement. Ezekiel told Browning and Mallister in a low, scary voice that they had to leave the property right away because they didn't have permission to be there, and that going near the house would be considered trespassing. Browning knew he was in a tough spot with the law. It's possible that the sound they heard could mean different things, and raiding the house based on that alone could make any evidence they found useless. But he also knew that anyone trapped inside could be killed before he got there if they turned back now. They could come back with enough help. The choice that had to be made in seconds was impossible. The standoff was short, but it seemed like it went on for a long time. Browning quickly thought about what he could do, weighing the risk to his life against the legal consequences of acting without permission. That's when the choice was made for him. The sound came from inside the house again, this time louder. It was a desperate scream that couldn't be understood. No doubt someone was calling for help, and that. The law changed everything about the situation. Browning made it very clear that he was going into the house because it was his duty as sheriff of Harland County, and he had a good reason to think that someone's life was in immediate danger. His words were carefully chosen to show that what he did was legal in case the case was later challenged in court. Mallister walked up to him and put his gun in his hands, which could be seen clearly. The men with Ezekiel raised their guns, but they didn't fire. There was a plan behind those cold eyes. No matter how far away his land was, Ezekiel knew that killing police would have terrible results. But he also knew that letting them into the house would destroy everything that his family had worked hard to build there. He stood still for long periods of time, thinking about the choices he couldn't make. At this very important moment, Chen came out from behind a tree with his own rifle pointed at the group of family men. He had seen the whole thing. Confrontation from where he was hiding, so he chose to come out to even the odds. The situation changed because he was there. Now there were 3 armed police officers and 5 family members. Chen was in a better position than the others because he was at an angle that let him see all of them. Ezekiel saw that he had been caught off guard and that the situation was over. The other men reluctantly copied his move of slowly lowering his gun, but he saw something more than defeat in her eyes. There was a cold resignation, as if there was any part of him that knew this day would come, that his family had been living an unsustainable life that would eventually fall apart. Moving aside, he made way for the house, but he didn't say anything. While Browning and Mallister moved quickly, they kept their weapons ready in case they needed to use them. Chen stayed outside and kept an eye on Ezekiel and the others. He was ready to step in if they did anything. The main house door wasn't locked, and when Browning opened it, they smelled something awful. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it smelled like dampness, mold, and something else that made his stomach turn. It was surprising how well furnished the inside of the house was. The main room had a big table, strong wooden chairs, and shelves full of books and other things. Everything was very neatly put away and almost too clean to be comfortable. But there was something wrong with the way it was decorated. It was common for rural homes to have things that didn't belong there. Pocket. There were neatly folded clothes that didn't fit any of the men in the family, rings and medals in a glass case, and watches lined up on a shelf like trophies. Mallister was mentally making a list of each thing when they heard another scream from below. There was a cellar. That was quick. Browning found the door, which was locked with a heavy bolt from the outside. He slid the bolt out of the way and opened the door, which revealed a dark wooden staircase. The smell coming from it was even stronger, which made his eyes water. Water. He turned on the flashlight he was carrying and started going down, closely followed by Mallister. They would always remember what they found in the basement. It was a huge room dug into the ground and held together with wooden beams. A man was lying in the far corner, chained to the wall with iron chains. He was hurt very badly. His face was swollen and scarred, and his clothes were torn and dirty. He put up his hand to protect his eyes and let out a weak groan when the flashlight beam hit him. "Marcus here. Webb, the merchant who went missing, is still alive but in terrible shape." Webb wasn't the only one, though. There was evidence in the basement that told a scary story that went back years. Chains were attached to the walls in several places, which suggests that more than one person was held there at the same time. At some point, something stained the dirt floor that Browning didn't want to name. Wallets, documents, clothes, and other things that clearly belonged to were piled up in one corner. A lot of different people. Mallister took Webb's chains off, while Browning looked around the rest of the cellar with growing fear. In the back, there was a door that was locked but not bolted. It was just shut. It was even worse when he opened it. It was a small room for storing things. There were jars and containers on wooden shelves, some of which he couldn't identify. Some of the tools were normal farm tools, but others had been changed in ways that made them look like they were used for bad things. What made things even worse were the records. It was either Ezekiel or someone in his family who took careful notes. There were notebooks stacked on a shelf with very neat handwriting inside them. He picked one up and started to read it. What he read made his blood run cold. Over the years, people had lived on the property. There were records of their names, dates of birth, physical descriptions, inventories of their things, and notes about how long they had been alive before they died. It was a record for more than 25 years ago. There were a lot of names that Browning had never heard of before. Some of them were from his own investigation. It turned out to be much bigger than he thought. According to those macabre notebooks, it wasn't just 17 disappearances like he had first thought. Over 25 years, there were at least 43 people. Webb was being taken out of the cellar and into the open air. He was half awake and crazy, but he was able to say that he had been captured 3 days before, when someone blocked his wagon on the trail. The men came at him out of the blue, knocked him out, and took him to this terrible place. He didn't know what they were going to do with him, but he had heard voices whispering in a language he didn't fully understand and heard sounds in the cellar at night. Browning left the house to talk to Ezekiel again, but this time he had proof that could not be argued with. The patriarch stayed where Chen had left him and kept a close eye on things. When he saw, Browning came out of the house with the notebooks in his hands. His face looked different. There was no regret or shame. There was a sense of acceptance of what had happened. His family secret had been found out, and now he would have to deal with the consequences. Browning told the police to arrest all of the family's men right away. Chen helped handcuff them with chains that they had found on the property, which was funny. The 5 men didn't fight back or try to get away. It seemed like once there, since they no longer had complete control over that remote area, they had given up and accepted their fate. Even though they knew they were about to be arrested, their faces stayed blank and showed no emotion. While Browning questioned Ezekiel, Mallister began searching the other buildings on the property in a planned way. The patriarch didn't want to talk at first, saying he had the right to remain silent, but Browning didn't need him to confess right away. There was already more than enough physical evidence to make arrests, tests. His real question was where the bodies of the other victims were, so they could be buried properly and their families could finally get answers. This time, Mallister found something very scary in one of the barns. A door to another underground area was hidden under wooden planks in the floor. This one was built with even more care than the main house's basement. He went down with his flashlight and found something that made him run back too. Get Browning back right away. As he talked about what he had seen, his voice shook as he tried to find the right words to describe how horrible that place was. Browning went down into this second underground space while preparing himself in his mind for what he would find. It was clear that years of hard work went into digging and strengthening that huge chamber. The walls were made of stone and packed down earth, the ceiling was held up by thick beams, and the final touches were placed with great care along the walls. Pieces of evidence about what happened to the family's victims. There were no bodies, at least not whole ones. There were clean, well-organized bones of different types and sizes. Skulls lined the shelves. Long bones were stacked neatly, and ribs were set up as if they were some kind of macabre archive. It was a collection of dead bodies that represented decades of crimes. It was kept with the same obsessive care that you would give a valuable book. Both investigators were stunned by how big the discovery was, temporarily unable to move. In his job, Browning had seen violence before. He had dealt with murders and seen victims in terrible situations, but this was more than anything else he had experienced. Not only the killing itself was very upsetting, but also the methodical organization and almost religious care with which the bodies had been kept and sorted. It showed a way of thinking that didn't see the victims as people, but as things to be gathered. Another thing that McAllister saw that it makes the scene even scarier. Small, yellowed paper tags with information written in the same handwriting as the notebooks found in the basement were found next to each group of bones. Name, date, and place of capture. It was a full inventory that was kept with as much accuracy as a government archive. The family not only did these crimes, but they also kept meticulous records of them as if they were normal business dealings. Browning had to force himself to keep track. At least 38 bodies were found. On the tags and the missing persons on the tags and the missing persons records he had gathered during his investigation. The store owner whose watch had been sold in Harlem was Jonathan Thomas Morrison. She was traveling alone and went missing in 1820. Her name was Elizabeth Porter. Samuel Chen, a gold miner who went missing in 1818, may have been related to his own investigator in a distant way. There were also a lot of names that didn't make the list, not show up in any official records of missing people. People whose whereabouts were never reported to the police and who had not been looked for. Someone traveling alone, someone without a family, or even a criminal on the run. The family picked their victims based on certain criteria, giving more weight to people who wouldn't be wanted and whose disappearance wouldn't lead to serious investigations. The crimes went on for so long without being caught because the people who were chosen were carefully chosen. As he wrote about this chamber of perfecting a way to catch, hold, and perfecting a way to catch, hold, and eventually kill travelers who came through the area. There was planning, working together, and each family member had a specific job to do. It was almost like a macabre business ran with an unsettling level of efficiency. Chen, who was outside keeping an eye on the prisoners, saw something interesting in the caught men's behavior. While Ezekiel kept quiet, one of the younger men started to display signs of anger. He shook his hands a little, his eyes darted around nervously, and he sometimes muttered something that no one could hear. Chen walked up to them and started asking them gentle questions using a method he had learned while working for the military. It turned out that the young man was Jacob, and he was 22 years old. He finally started to talk. His words came out in pieces that didn't fit together, but over time they put together a disturbing story. He was born on that farm and grew up under Ezekiel's strict rule. He had never been outside of those mountains. His family had been doing this for as long as he could remember. They would catch travelers, hold them until they were no longer useful, and then get rid of their bodies in a way that would make sure they would never be found. Jacob talked about how the plan worked. Family members often walked the trails and looked for people who seemed like they might be good travelers. They looked at the person to see if they were traveling alone, if they were carrying valuables, and if they looked like they had family waiting for them somewhere. Once a victim was chosen, they used different excuses to get them to come to the property, such as offering help, selling provisions, or just blocking the trail to make them face the criminals directly. At first, the victims were kept in the basement, sometimes for days or even weeks. During this time, they had to say where they kept their money, if they had any hidden valuables, and if they thought anyone would come, trying to find them. The family got all the useful information out of their prisoners before killing them. The things were then sold in faraway cities over the course of months or years, being careful not to make anyone suspicious. The money and valuable items were shared among family members, giving them wealth that farmers who lived alone could never legally get. When asked about the bodies, Jacob said in a monotone, "They were first buried in remote mountain locations," but Ezekiel had become obsessed with something else over time. He started to take care of the bones by cleaning them in ways Jacob didn't want to go into detail about and putting them away like they were valuable treasures. He said it was a way to remember the victims and keep them close to the family. No one else in the group questioned this sick explanation because they knew that questioning Ezekiel would lead to harsh punishments. When Chen came out of the underground chamber, he told Browning this information. When Jacob told the truth, disturbing, but it was necessary to understand how this situation had come about. There was more to it than just bad men choosing to hurt people. Generations of being alone and being controlled by a deeply troubled patriarch had shaped the whole family line. It wasn't their fault that Jacob and the others had been taught that this was normal and how their family survived in the harsh mountains. They were still responsible. It was clear that they were all involved in the crimes. All had. Dozens of innocent people suffered and died because of it. At that time, Cookie's laws meant that they would all be tried and probably put to death. Browning knew this. Multiple murder was a capital crime, and there was so much evidence that the jury would not hesitate to find the person guilty. An investigation of the property went on all day and into the night. Mallister found the secret entrance to the forest that Chen had seen Ezekiel going to. They were inside this change-natural cave when was a macabre treasure trove full of victims' clothes, documents, and stolen money hidden in secret places. It was a macabre treasure trove full of records about the whole criminal business the family ran. They found something in one of the smaller buildings that made the situation even scarier. In a workshop, the victims' personal items were changed before they were sold. The engravings on the watches were taken off. Rings were broken up and put back together again. Documents were set on fire. It was an amazing example of how sophisticated it is to launder stolen goods. The family not only killed their victims but also carefully erased all traces of them, making it almost impossible to find out who owned the things they took. Browning had everything carefully categorized and kept as proof. He was sure that the upcoming trial would be one of the most important in Kentucky history, so he made sure that every detail was carefully written down. This is where he sent Chen, to talk again while they waited for more to talk again while they waited for more help to arrive. The patriarch had been quiet all day, just watching as investigators dug up his family's secrets. But now, maybe because he felt like he had nothing more to hide, he finally spoke up. What he said was just as scary as anything else they had found. Ezekiel told them. He said calmly and without any shame that this was how his family had always lived. When his grandfather moved to these mountains in the late 1700s, he started the tradition, finding that attacking travelers made more money than any other legal way to get help. His father kept running the business and grew it, and over many years he improved the system. He did it because it was his way of life and something his father had taught him. He talked about how. He taught the younger ones, how he taught them to find good targets, and how he punished them when they did something wrong that could put the family in danger. He used the same tone of voice to talk about teaching farming or carpentry. He saw capturing and killing travelers as just a useful skill that would help his family stay alive in the dangerous Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains went dark, and the cold air cut right through you. On his way to the house, Browning lit lanterns all around it, waited for more help to arrive. Shadows moved back and forth between the buildings, making shapes that looked like they were moving on their own. Staying here after the sun went down was very unsettling. Mallister kept searching carefully, determined to find every piece of evidence, even though he knew what had been going on there for so many years in the dark. He found something in one of the smaller storage rooms that was another important piece of the puzzle. There were deals, receipts for sales made in different cities in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia over the last 15 years. Not only did the family rob people, they also kept careful records of how they turned stolen goods into cash. It was hard to believe the numbers. Over 20 years, the family had built up a fortune of about $15,000, which was a lot of money at the time. Some of this money was kept secret, buried in glass jars, or hidden in different places on the property. Separate areas. A different part of the money had been used to make improvements to the property, which gave it the infrastructure it needed to keep running more efficiently. Mallister noticed something in these financial records that made him question everything he thought he knew about the case. The names of merchants and middlemen from different cities were written next to each transaction. Some of these people showed up over and over again over the years, always buying valuables without, asking about where they came from. In this way, it seemed like the family did not completely work alone. Outsiders at least had a feeling that these assets might not be what they seemed to be, but they chose to ignore their feelings in order to make money. Browning felt a mix of anger and resignation when he heard this news. He thought the investigation was almost over, but it might just be starting up again. If there were outside aids that made things easier for the family, was to make sure that the main criminals were brought to justice. About 4 hours after he left, Chen came back with the deputy sheriff of a neighboring county, a local doctor, and 3 more armed men to keep everyone safe. The doctor started treating Marcus Webb right away, looking at his injuries and figuring out that he needed to go to the hospital as soon as it was safe to do so. Webb had broken bones, was severely dehydrated, and had been badly hurt, but he would live. Both his physical and mental health would take a long time to get better. When Browning told the deputy sheriff, William Porter, what he had found, Porter looked very upset. After more than 20 years as a police officer, Porter thought he had seen everything, but this was beyond what he knew. When he went down into the ground chamber, where the body of the victim was laid out, he had to leave quickly because he couldn't control how he felt. He went outside for a while to get some fresh air before going back to work. Investigators worked together to come up with a plan to fully record the crime scene and get both the prisoners and the evidence to the right places. They chose to take the 5 men they had caught to the Harlan jail at dawn, where they would be closely watched. The physical evidence would be sorted and moved separately, with extra care given to notebooks and papers that described the crimes. The bodies would have to be carefully taken out and, if possible, identified so that they could be sent back to their families. As they watched over the property at night, Jacob kept talking to Chen. The young man looked glad to finally be able to share the weight he had been carrying for years. He talked about what it was like to grow up in that family and how cruelty and violence were seen as normal, everyday life. As a child, he saw things that would have broken the mind of any normal person, but in that family line, it was just something that was expected to happen. He told how his father, who was one of Ezekiel's brothers, had taken him to see a traveler being captured when he was only 13 years old. It was portrayed as a rite of passage, or an introduction to the ways of the family. He remembered how scared the victim looked, a middle-aged man pleading for help, and how his father had turned him down. Told her that being kind was a sign of weakness, and that the family's survival depended on being cruel. Over the next few years, Jacob slowly became a part of every part of the business. He learned how to find weak targets, set traps, and keep prisoners under control. But unlike Ezekiel and the others, Jacob never stopped caring about things. Every victim followed him around. He stayed awake all night because of all the screams. He had many times thought about running away, but Ezekiel's fear and the fact that he had no idea what was beyond the mountains kept him trapped. Chen had a lot of different feelings as he listened to this story. On the one hand, it was clear that Jacob was a victim of his birth and had been shaped from a young age by a sick family history. On the other hand, he had actively taken part in horrible crimes that caused innocent people to suffer. In such a complicated case, there was no easy answer to the question of who was at fault and responsible. It would have been the legal system to pick out those lines. As the night went on, Browning set up watch shifts to keep the prisoners safe and make sure that no evidence was tampered with. He was so tired that he couldn't sleep, so he took the first watch. He couldn't stop thinking about all the lives they had lost and what they had found. While he was sheriff, this family could do whatever they wanted without getting caught because he didn't know how bad things were in his own county. A sense of having failed weighed a lot on him. At first, he had written down 17 cases of missing people, but things were much worse than that. 43 victims in 25 years, and there may be more that haven't been found yet. If he had looked into this sooner, how many of these people could have been saved? If he had stuck with it longer and believed the rumors and stories that people in the area were telling him, but he knew that was being too hard on himself. The family had been very smart about how they did business. They carefully picked their victims and cleaned up all the evidence, staying out of the way. Without the specific events that made them look into it more, without Foster's luck making it through the encounter on the trail, and without Webb's wagon being found at the right time, the family might have kept going forever. Because of the Appalachians, it was hard for people in different counties to talk to each other, and there weren't many police officers around at the time, making it easy for crimes like these to happen. When dawn finally came, it brought pale. As the morning mist lifted from the mountains and let light through, Browning felt a mix of relief and fear. The worst of what they found was over. But now came the just as hard part: going to court to get justice, dealing with the public's scrutiny, and helping the families of the victims who would finally have answers after years of painful uncertainty. It would take a long time and be very hard on everyone's emotions. The prisoners were getting ready to be taken somewhere. Ezekiel stayed as still and quiet as the night before, but the others showed signs of being tired and stressed. Jacob, in particular, looked like he was hurt. He could see that his decision to help investigators was weighing on him. He was aware that speaking out had hurt his family, but he seemed happy to be free of that life at last. He would spend years trying to figure out how to make sense of this contradiction. The caravan left the property in the middle of the morning. Browning led the group, and the prisoners in a wagon closely watched by armed men came after. Finally, there was another wagon with Marcus Webb and some of the most important evidence. Mallister, Chen, and other men would stay on the property with them to keep cataloging and protecting the site until everything could be processed properly. It took almost the whole day to get down through the mountain trails. During that time, Browning thought about how he would present the case to the state's authorities and then to the public. He had to be careful about how he told people about the crimes because they were so upsetting. There is a fine line between giving enough information and either making people panic or being too interested in death and dying. The families of the victims should have been told the truth, but with the right amount of care. A crowd had already formed by the time they got to Harlem, and the prisoners were officially booked and locked up. News spread quickly even back then, and in nearby towns, rumors of shocking discoveries in the mountains were going around. Browning had to add more guards to the jail to make sure. Instead of angry crowds, the law was used to do what was right. People were often hanged in Kentucky at that time when very bad crimes were discovered. Browning worked hard over the next few days to put together the formal case against the 5 men. The notebooks of Ezekiel, the bodies, the stolen goods that were found, and the statements of Marcus Webb and eventually Jacob himself, who agreed to testify against the other family members, were all very strong pieces of evidence, in exchange for something at sentencing. 2 weeks after the arrests, State Attorney Theodore Harrison came to Harlem with a group of paralegals and more investigators. He set up a temporary office in the county courthouse and started going through all of Browning's evidence in a planned way. It was quickly clear to him how big the case was. This wasn't just a murder trial. It might have been the biggest and most complicated criminal case in Kentucky's history up to that point. Harrison chose to bring charges against all 5 men at the same time, but on different counts, to make sure that each man's guilt was proven correctly. Ezekiel would be charged with 43 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each person whose name was in the records. The other family members would be charged with different amounts of crimes based on how long they had been involved with the crime. Jacob would be charged with fewer crimes and might get a lighter sentence because he is the youngest and has shown remorse. While the lawyers worked on the case, Mallister and Chen put more work into the mountain property. They got experts from Frankfurt to help them find and properly identify the bodies. The work was very detailed and emotionally draining, and it took weeks to finish. Each set of bones was carefully taken out of the underground chamber, photographed, categorized, and made ready to be identified and given back to the families. Due to limited resources at the time, the identification process was hard. There was no access to modern forensic testing. So, the team relied on matching physical traits seen in missing people with descriptions of those people, matching personal items found with lists given by families, and using Ezekiel's notes as a guide. Even though it wasn't easy, they were able to positively identify 27 of the 43 victims who had been reported. The hardest part of the whole process might have been telling the families. Browning went to a number of cities and states himself to let family and friends know that their loved ones had been found and were finally safe. Finally getting answers after years of bitter hope. When some families heard the news, they were both relieved and sad. They were glad that they could finally bury their loved ones properly. Some people were angry and asked why it took so long for someone to figure out why so many people had to die before anything was done. Browning remembered one visit in particular very well. He went to Virginia to tell Martha Morrison, who was married to Jonathan Thomas Morrison, that her husband's body had been found 6 years after he went missing. Martha, a woman in her 50s, had been stuck in a painful limbo for so long because she didn't know what would happen to her husband. When Browning gave her the silver pocket watch with his initials on it, she held it to her chest and cried quietly for a long time. She told Browning that Jonathan had been a good man who worked hard and only traveled to support his family. On that terrible fall night in 1826, he went missing while coming back from a business trip. Martha had been waiting for news for months and called the police in several counties and even hired private investigators, but they didn't find anything. She had to finally accept that she probably would never know what happened and that she would have to live her whole life not knowing what happened. Now that she had answers, Martha said something that Browning would hear from many other families. She said that the torture of not knowing was worse than telling the truth, no matter how horrible it was. Being aware that Jonathan hadn't left her, that he hadn't. Choosing to disappear, but had been hurt by terrible things he couldn't change, gave him a certain kind of peace. It was finally time for her to accept that he was dead. She could have a proper funeral and start rebuilding her life after decades of emotional suspension. At the same time, the case started to be talked about outside of Kooky. In bigger cities like Louisville, Cincinnati, and even Nashville, newspapers started to write about the find in the Appalachians. Each story was different. Different newspapers reported the news differently. Some lied about shocking details, while others tried to report the facts in a sensible way. The family estate became famous as a terrifyingly scary place, a sign of the evil that could be found in remote parts of the country. The huge amount of public interest put even more pressure on Harrison and his team to make sure the trial went perfectly. Any mistake in the process or failure to follow the law's rules could lead to successful appeals or even an acquittal. Harrison knew that everyone was watching, and that this case would set a standard for how serial killers were punished. He also knew that he had to get justice without hurting the integrity of the legal system. In August 1832, 4 months after the first arrests, the jury selection process began. Harrison started with Ezekiel's trial because he knew that as the family patriarch and leader of the crime ring, he had the strongest and most important case. It was very hard to find jurors who were fair. Almost everyone in. The people in Harlan County and the nearby areas knew about the case and had strong opinions about it. In the end, a jury of 12 men was chosen. Most of them lived in remote, rural areas and had little to no experience with the specifics of the case. Harrison carefully explained what they were supposed to do and stressed that they should only use the evidence presented in court and not rumors or news stories when making their decision. Silas Bradford, an experienced magistrate who was the judge in charge, made it official. He made it clear that he would be very strict during the trial and make sure that both the prosecution and the defense had a fair chance to present their cases. Daniel Hutchinson and Robert Myers, 2 lawyers from Frankfort, were hired by the court to be Ezekiel's defense lawyers because he didn't have enough money to hire his own lawyer after all of his assets were taken away. Both lawyers knew it would be very hard to defend their clients. There was a lot of physical proof. Ezekiel's own. Careful records proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he had done wrong, and reliable witnesses could attest to the facts found at the property. Hutchinson chose to take a stance where he would admit the basic facts but argue that there were mitigating circumstances. He wanted to show that Ezekiel was a product of his environment. Growing up in extreme isolation by a family that was already involved in crime and not getting any formal education or learning about normal morals. It wasn't a defense that would get them off, but it could. Instead of the death penalty, they might get life in prison. The trial began on a warm September morning. There were a lot of people in the courtroom, including families of the victims, reporters from several states, and curious people from the area. People were feeling a lot of different emotions, from intense anger to morbid fascination. Judge Bradford had to make strict rules about behavior and threatened to kick out anyone who caused problems. Harrison started with a detailed statement that set the scene for the story. He talked about the crimes, showed the main evidence he would use to prove them, and painted a picture of Ezekiel as a cunning killer who killed dozens of innocent people over the course of decades. His speech was serious but powerful. It focused on facts without appealing to emotions too much, and it built credibility through careful attention to detail. Harrison called a series of witnesses in the first few weeks of the trial who laid out the main points of the case. Browning talked at length about his research, telling what he did to get to the family property. Mallister and Chen gave detailed accounts of the physical things that were found at the scene. The doctor who treated Marcus Webb talked about the wounds he got while being held captive. The most exciting part of the trial then began. Marcus Webb himself took the stand as a witness. In a voice that was clearly shaking from what he had been through, he talked about how he had been captured and held in horrible conditions in the basement for days on end, ready to be killed. He said he heard voices talking about his fate, was always thirsty and hungry, and that the darkness of that underground space was too much for him to bear. During his testimony, several members of the jury got very emotional. Marcus Webb's testimony went on for almost 3 days, and Harrison carefully went over every detail of his experience with him. Webb talked about how 3 men who seemed to appear out of nowhere approached him on the trail. He said he tried to stay calm and friendly, but was met with hostility. When he tried to keep going, he was brutally attacked. He remembered waking up in the dark basement, chained to the wall and in a lot of pain. He had no idea where he was or what was going to happen next. While he was being held captive, Webb sometimes heard voices arguing in low tones that he couldn't fully understand. At one very scary time, Ezekiel went down to the basement and asked him a lot of questions about his family, his business, and his life. Webb, naturally, he knew he was being tested and that the answers he gave would determine how long he would live. He lied that family members were waiting for him and that he had a lot of business contacts. He also tried very hard to make it look like he would be wanted if he disappeared. During cross-examination, the defense tried to call Webb's credibility into question by saying that his trauma might have messed up his memories, or that he might be exaggerating what happened. Hawthorne knew he was in a dangerous place, though. Webb had it clear. The victim is a sympathetic figure, and if you attack him too hard, you might turn off the jury. He finally gave up, even though all he had done was point out small inconsistencies and small details that didn't have a big effect on the main story. After Webb Harrison presented the testimony of Jacob, the youngest member of the family who had agreed to help the prosecution, Jacob looked nervous as he took the stand and avoided making eye contact with Ezekiel, who stared at him with a cold, unreadable stare, using words. In a low, hesitant voice, the young man explained how the family worked, confirming all the facts that the investigation had found and giving more information about how decisions were made and roles were assigned. Jacob said in court that Ezekiel was in charge of every part of the family business. He chose which travelers would be attacked, when they would happen, how long the victims would be kept alive, and how their bodies would be thrown away in the end. The rest of the family, they just did what they were told, knowing that disobeying would lead to harsh punishments. Jacob said that he saw Ezekiel hit his own brothers when they didn't agree with his decisions or made mistakes during operations. Even more upsetting was Jacob's story about how he slowly became involved with the family's activities. He talked about the first time, when he was 13, he had to watch a traveler being captured and then killed. He remembered throwing up afterward and crying through the night, but also how his father told him to toughen up because being sensitive was a luxury they couldn't have in the harsh Appalachians. At some point, Jacob said, he stopped feeling anything emotionally. He didn't stop thinking it was wrong. He just learned to hide those thoughts in order to stay alive.